was a returnee with Zerubbabel in 538 BC, who had been carried away by Nebuchadnezzar. Nehemiah was a descendant of those carried into Babylonian captivity and gained prominence after the Persians defeated the Babylonians. He attained a very influential position of personal cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes. Okay, I got a nod, good. And cupbearer occurs 3 times in the King James versions. Pharaoh's cupbearer was a butler. Solomon had cupbearers, but the only cupbearer mentioned by name is Nehemiah. And the first duty of a cupbearer is to protect the king against poison and death. So they would taste different things and drink different things to make sure that it was okay and not poisoned. He literally had the king's life in his hands. Obviously a trusted man, right? You're not going to put somebody in there that you don't trust in that position. Probably of a high rank, and very likely had the king's ear and or advised the king. So I thought that was very interesting. He was appointed governor of the province surrounding Jerusalem and given letters of safe passage by the king, and had the authority to secure materials from the king's forest to rebuild. Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem around 444 BC and began his work by secretly surveying the remains of Jerusalem. And according to the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah 6:15, the work was completed in 52 days, the wall. And Nehemiah's first order of business was, so to speak, was to repair the walls, but he continued well beyond that original purpose and helped awaken the Jewish people in a sense of national honor, restoring dignity to Jerusalem, and was known as quite the man and really a man of God. He was also known for correcting several abuses and settling grievances and establishing law and order. He was instrumental in reviving worship by encouraging the reading of the law, celebrating the Feast of the Tabernacles, observing national fast, purifying the temple, improving the support of the priesthood, and revitalizing the observance of the Sabbath, and a lot more. Nehemiah was what I would call a man of action. He did not wait for a miracle from God or someone else to step up. Instead, he stepped up himself and took control of the situation. And he saw the desperate position of his people and took extreme measures without waiting around. One could truly call him God's man of the hour, so to speak. So those are kind of my opening notes there. And moving into the kind of the body of the lesson here. Unfortunately, my eyes are at that age where sometimes I need them and the glasses, and sometimes I don't, and it doesn't work either way around the other way. So, Nehemiah had the support of the king in rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem. Nevertheless, the enemies of the Jews characterized the rebuilding effort as a rebellion against the Persian Empire. And those opposed to the project asked, "What is this thing that you are doing?" And basically, are you going to rebel against the king? And that's in Nehemiah 2:19. But despite the opposition, the Jews began the task of replacing what Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed approximately 140 years earlier. The next couple paragraphs, to me really talks about Nehemiah being a true leader. The difficulty of rebuilding Jerusalem's wall can only be appreciated when the size of the project is considered. Although scholars differ on the precise dimensions of the Nehemiah's wall, with estimates placing the circumference of the wall between 2.5 and 2.5 miles, the task was obviously extensive. When we add that the completed wall was potentially 8 feet thick, it is amazing the Jews were able to finish the project in only 52 days. It's even more impressive when we remember that the Jews built it while facing constant persecution and potentially being attacked as well. For his efforts, Nehemiah is rightly remembered as one of the great leaders of God's people and succeeded in motivating individuals from various backgrounds to work together and succeeded in distributing the work so the laborers were motivated yet not overwhelmed. And importantly, succeeded in encouraging the Jews to continue their efforts even as they faced ridicule, discouragement, and fear. And when completed, the wall provided a sense of physical security to the battered people. More importantly, knowing the rebuilding of the wall represented a reclaiming of the land after the destruction and exile, and Nehemiah's steady hand guiding the Jews through adversity was the key to the entire process. And there's a lot we can learn from Nehemiah. I think about leaders and leadership, and we probably all met people in our lives that we would follow, we agreed with, that motivated us. I had several in the military when I was in the Marine Corps. I had a couple of lieutenants that I would have done anything for that were just brilliant people and very fair to the enlisted people, which I was. I had a college professor that when I went back to college after I got out of the Marine Corps, and I was not a very good student prior to, I will admit, but took it a lot more seriously when I got out. And he really paved the way for me through college and in life. He was a friend of my father's, which was nice to be able to talk to him about that kind of thing too. My father taught with him, but really showed me the way, motivated me to carry on, finish my degree, and to seek higher things. And when I got hired into banking after I graduated, which I didn't have a clue what I was going to do. My degree was in geography. So not finance, not banking, not accounting. So really that doesn't mean a ton in the banking world, right? But he wrote me the nicest card and continued to motivate me and things like that. And I'm sure you all have had people like that. And within the church too, right? We've had elders and deacons. We've had just members. We've had preachers. We've had teachers. I remember growing up in Archdale Church of Christ in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I had a teacher several years in a row as I would continue to move up from whatever 5th grade to 6th grade and things like that. Her name was Geneva Rickleton, and she was the sweetest lady in the world, and she taught me and the other kids my age for years, and really made an impression on me as well. And I take those impressions with me, and try to have some of the same characteristics as those people. But looking at what Nehemiah did, and the way he organized things, and the way that he made sure that his people were protected, and the decisions he made, and a lot of them to me are semi-militaristic, right? Arming his people, having guards positioned in correct places, having the workers work near or with their families. In any kind of confrontation, I think most individuals and groups of people are much more likely to put up a stronger defense, so to speak, when you're protecting either someone you love or something you love or your own country, right, versus being in another country and fighting for that country potentially. So very smart. Any comments about that from anybody?
Yes, indeed, great leadership study for this guy. And a great motivator. That's implicit in what you're saying, but that was a big thing with him. I mean, when there's one here in this lesson where account where their courage when he seemed that he had to give them a pep talk and kind of reorganize
Yeah. This is going to help protect you and your family and others that you love and care about and your tribe and everything else, right?
And you got mentioned, you got praying, and you got mentioning God. He's behind us, he's with us.
And Nehemiah never took credit for this. He gave all the credit to God. And that could have been something that most leaders probably would have forgotten about, right?
That's not a trait of politics.
No, I would agree with that. All right. The enemies of the Jews obviously noticed the progress being made on Jerusalem's walls. Sanballat, who was disturbed when Nehemiah came to Jerusalem and who suggested that the rebuilding effort was an act of rebellion against the king, Nehemiah 2:10 and 19, was furious and very indignant and mocked the Jews. Verse 1. Secular history identifies this individual as the governor of Samaria and giving his seemingly authority over the army of Samaria. I'm not sure. Does anybody know how big the army of Samaria was? Any idea? I really don't know. I couldn't really find anything. But I was curious. I am curious to know how big that was and what it would compare to their forces, right? His intense interest in the Jews' situation can easily be reckoned in light of this information. As a Samaritan leader, he doubtlessly wanted to maintain some influence over Jerusalem. Fortified wall around the city would make this unlikely, and consequently he was very angry and greatly enraged. Speaking to his supporters, Sanballat asked a series of questions designed to criticize and belittle the Jews' efforts. Nehemiah 4:2. The Samaritan leader probably realized how powerful a tool ridicule can be, for even good men can be discouraged. See Jeremiah 9:2 and 27 through 9. His terminology is especially revealing. Notice that Sanballat referred to the Jews as feeble, a term that is obviously derogatory. And, I don't know the context of feeble back in that time, but definitely a derogatory term. And I would imagine most people in here have had somebody or persons or groups over the course of our lifetimes that have kind of done the same things to us and tried to discourage us or made fun of us or ridiculed us or whatever. And it's hard to persevere through those types of things. But Nehemiah and the people were able to, and a lot of that had to do, and most of it had to do with not only God, but Nehemiah's leadership. His questions also raised doubts about whether the project could be completed, whether the worship of God would affect the outcome of their labors, and whether the materials utilized were even viable. Not surprisingly, Sanballat's comrade Tobiah joined in the ridicule and chided, "Whatever they build, even if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall." Now that's probably, I don't know that we would use the term fox today if we were talking, but, a fox probably weighs, 10, 15 pounds, I would guess. I don't know. I didn't do any research about that. But, a very lightweight, smaller animal and cannot, the wall could not withstand even something that small. So, interesting. And of course, that comment was meant as an insult to the workmanship of the Jews. But instead of responding to these degrading remarks, Nehemiah prayed to God for relief, describing the people as despised. The leader of the Jews petitioned God to deal with Judah's enemies, Nehemiah 4:4, and was especially troubled by the way the enemies insulted God, verse 5. Thus his prayer requested God's intervention on the behalf of the people. Nehemiah's tone and focus remind us of the imprecatory Psalms, for example, Psalms 137. And although we are not used to focusing on the treatment of the wicked in prayer, if we pray for truth to prevail, we are implicitly requesting the defeat of evil. This prayer does not indicate a lack of compassion on Nehemiah's part. His primary focus was doing God's will. Thus, his prayer simply requested divine justice. Nehemiah's unwillingness to stop and publicly respond to the insults and ridicule extended by Sanballat and Tobiah paid dividends. Work on the wall did not cease even for a short time. Consequently, he reported, "So we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Nehemiah 4:6. Even the slightest interruption in the rebuilding effort could have been detrimental. Thus, Nehemiah's tact demonstrated that not every accusation deserves recognition. Perhaps he thought of the wise of Proverbs 26:4, do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like him. Regardless, when God's people work together, great things result. This, to me, just again shows how smart he is. He didn't take the bait, right? He didn't take the bait, and he didn't let his people be influenced by him and kept motivating them. And that was probably difficult to do. I mean, I think human beings, a lot of times by nature, can be very defensive, right? And if somebody calls somebody a name or says something derogatory, you want to respond to that, right? Whether that's right or whether that's wrong, but I think that is probably human nature. So after all these things that, he's insulting God, he's insulting Nehemiah, he's insulting his people, they are insulting the workmanship and what they can actually do and what they can create and build, and doesn't reply to them. Any comments or questions so far?
David, one thought occurs to me here.
Yes, sir.
This Sanballat, and I read that previously, that he apparently was, at this point, governor of Samaria by Artaxerxes. I mean, he served at the will of the king. And Nehemiah had, as we'd seen earlier, he had a letter from the king to the different countries along different provinces along the way, telling them what they're up to, because he had this big entourage, thousands of people with him, moving through territory. And so, presumably, he presented his credentials, as it were, the letter from the king, who Sanballat also served, saying this is the permission from the king, the great king, to do what you're doing. Well, they're not, but they're like 900 miles away, like from, Mobile to Chicago, away from the king. And this guy, Sanballat, is just not going to have it, because he's going to have this big bastion right in the middle of his territory here. So, it's just an interesting thought to me that, he's far enough away from the king that he's going to do what he's going to do.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's no phones, there's no quick communication, right? But it gave him permission to do those things, travel to get items to rebuild the wall and help his people as well, I believe, right? Thank you. When these efforts failed to stop the Jews by mocking their efforts, the angers of the Samaritans intensified. Adversaries from every side of Jerusalem, Samaritans from the north, Ammonites from the east, Arabians from the south, and Ashdodites from the west, conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. Verse 8. They seemed to believe brute force would accomplish what intimidation failed to do. Evidently, these enemies did not try to mask their plan, for Nehemiah was aware of it and responded accordingly. He reported, "Nevertheless, we made our prayer to God, and because of them set a watch against them day and night." Verse 9. And it's significant that the Jews did not rely solely on either prayer or their own defenses. Rather, they employed both. But despite Nehemiah's efforts to encourage the Jews, the strength of the people began to waver. Making this known, Judah said, "The strength of the laborers is failing, and there is so much rubbish that we are not able to build the wall." Nehemiah 4:10. The discouragement of the people felt was no doubt due in part to the efforts of their enemies. Fear can certainly serve as a distraction, and Jews' enemies attempted to convince them that an attack might occur at any time. Verse 11. Additionally, their discouragement also sprung from the enormity of the task. The people not only had to rebuild this wall, but it would also remove or at least avoid the rubble left from the previous wall's destruction. The effort required to construct the new wall did not lessen during the process, for as the wall increased in height, the upper courses required more and more effort to raise the stones. When the warning strength of the Jews was coupled with the continual threats issued by the enemies, anxiety resulted. The wall was going to be finished. Nehemiah had to act quickly. And when I think about the size and scope of this wall, and whatever the previous remnants were from the destroyed wall that they had to move or avoid or build around, whatever the case may be, I don't know exactly what kind of tools or platforms they have, but they don't have what we have today, right? Caterpillar movers, dozers, whatever you want to call it. Ronnie probably knows more about that than I do, but they didn't have these big things that made life a lot easier and made things quicker. They were doing this all with manual labor, with just strength of the people, right? And strength of God. It's even, thinking back, the 2 or 2.5 miles doesn't seem like a long distance, but when you're building something that's that high and 8 feet wide and I would assume made out of stone and mortar and things like that, and getting rid of the rubble from before, what an exhausting task, right? What an exhausting task. Acting decisively, Nehemiah positioned men behind the lower parts of the wall and at the openings. He also set the people according to their families with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And besides placing Jews in defensive positions, Nehemiah provided the people with extra incentive of protecting and working alongside their own families. Really, looking back to when I was in the Marine Corps, this part of this seems like a military operation, right? In a lot of ways. And again, or very militaristic, as we said before. But I think about the planning and, again, the wisdom of Nehemiah to do these things and enact these things in the manner in which he did certainly made a difference, right? As opposed to having, families split apart, and a brother over here and a brother over here, whatever, and having them together. And again, trying to help their own out. Having done so, Nehemiah issued 3 significant charges to all of the people. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. And although the Jews were growing weary, they had no reason to succumb to the threats of their enemies. They were to refrain from fear and was tied directly to a remembrance of the power of God. Nehemiah understood that the God who had fought for his people in days gone by was still capable, and he did not want the people to forget that fact. It was as if Nehemiah was asking, if God is for us, who can be against us? Romans 8:31. Finally, the Jews' leader reminded them of the importance of their immediate efforts. They were defending their own families. They could not quit, and they could not stop being vigilant. The safety of their loved ones was at stake. Nehemiah's leadership through this difficult time proved successful, and having devised a plan to thwart the efforts of the Jews' enemies, he happily reported, all of us returned to the wall, everyone to his work. 4:15. Importantly, Nehemiah did not take credit for the victory. Instead, he credited God for bringing the enemy's plot to nothing. This does not mean the Jews let their guard down. If anything, that they were more vigilant from this point onward. Half the servants stood guard while the other half worked. Verse 16, and those who built did so with their swords by their sides. Verse 18, always ready to fight, right? Nehemiah's remarkable strategy reinvigorated a weary people, and the work on the wall continued. In hope of thwarting any future attack, Nehemiah also devised a plan to summon the people in case they were surprised by their enemies. Speaking to the Jews, he said, the work is great and extensive, and we are separated far from one another on the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. Nehemiah 4:19 and 20. I think of that as, implementing an alarm system, right? It's not any different than sentries or alarm system potentially at your home in a different respect. But having that alarm system set up to keep his people safe and ready to fight. With a firm belief that God was with them and a plan to care for one another in place, the Jews labored in the work, and half the men held the spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. And those who trust God and love one another can accomplish great things. Any questions or comments so far? All right. Let's go to applications. So number one, it's not always easy to deal with the persecution from others. Although the children rhyme says, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me." The truth is that these words of others are often painful. Learning how to best deal with persecution is difficult. Nehemiah's refusal to respond to the mocks of Sanballat and Tobiah shows that there is a time that we should not even acknowledge the taunts of others. Instead, we should allow our lives to speak for themselves. And we talked some about that already. But yes, it is difficult. And, I've found when somebody's attacked me with words before that I've responded, and that was probably not the right thing to do. And I was defensive, right? And when I should have just let it go, and, others around me hopefully see the actions and what I've done with my life and how I treat people and things like that. And that speaks for itself. Comments about that first one? Anybody?
In addition, obviously, as they experience here, in addition to being painful, it can be discouraging, right? Which, and that's what happened here, right? It was, it really put them off their game, so to speak. He had to go to great pains as a good leader that he was to get them back on track, get them back to work.
And I think to kind of piggyback on that, Jim, I think about if a person or a group of people tells you something that is not true but is making a derogatory comment about you enough times, you really start to think, right, is that true? Or I need to do something so they don't think this way, and maybe that's sin, right? So they're causing you to act and potentially and thinking it in a way that you shouldn't, which is never a good thing. Point 2. Christians must maintain a balance between their prayers and actions. When threatened by the enemies, the Jews turned to God in prayer, but also set a watch. Importantly, Jesus admonished his followers to do the same in hopes of shunning temptation. Comments?
I'm old enough to remember as a child. I was a child during World War II, and I remember you remember there was a song on the heels of Pearl Harbor, which really was the country quick had to get geared up quickly. Of course, all the Rosie the Riveters,
Mm-hmm.
although we were part of the civilian effort for the war, but there was the song, "Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition," and that sort of captured the same idea. I think it did. You've got to look to God for His support. You've got to get busy yourself. And interestingly, in the chapter that we didn't really cover in this book, from the latter part of the book of Ezra, Ezra kept weeping and lying in the dust and so on after he came back and saw how bad things were. And one of the leaders from among the people said to him, "Fine, get up and let's get with it here, get busy here." I mean, at some point, you can't just be disabled, with grief, right, or whatever about your own life or whatever. And that they were sort of chiding him today, that get up off the dirt, that's out of the dust, and provide some leadership. And so, prayer and action, right?
Yeah, I don't think God expects us to pray for things, even if they're the right things, and then sit around and do nothing. It's set a course of action and do everything that you possibly can to help rectify the situation or make the situation happen, depending on what we're talking about, and go from there. Number 3, Nehemiah's strategy was successful in part because he placed people in areas where they had a vested interest. Churches would do well to involve members in similar works. For example, youth ministry is never more successful than when parents take the leading role. Leaders who have the foresight to involve members in ministries about which they are passionate will revitalize weary Christians. And I think that's probably true in any application, whether it's scholastically, at work, hobbies, anything. Get people to talk about, what they have an interest in, what they enjoy, what they're good at, what they're knowledgeable about. And it offers, I think, a higher level of sharing. Comments about number 3 before we go to the questions? Maybe we can actually get some questions in this time. All right. First question, how large was the wall Nehemiah and the Jews built? That is correct. Thank you. What office did Sanballat supposedly hold? Why would he be interested in keeping the Jerusalem wall from being built? Yep, exactly. How did Sanballat initially try to oppose the Jews' efforts? Mock them. He also asked a series of questions to his supporters to criticize and belittle the Jewish effort, discouragement of the Jews, specifically referred to the Jews as feeble, and then tried to raise doubts through his questions of whether the wall could actually be built or not, whether their worship of God would affect the outcomes of their labors, and whether the actual materials they were using were even viable for the task at hand. What animal did Tobiah say would break down the wall that the Jews were building? Little fox. Is there any significance to it being a fox? I don't know of any. Just a lightweight animal. Okay. Number 5. How did Nehemiah respond to their mocks? Prayed. Anything else?
That's it. Basically, he didn't respond, right?
Yeah, everything kept going, right? And strengthened their defensive posture against their enemies as well, right? Number 6, how did the enemies respond after their criticisms were dismissed?
They ratcheted it up, made it step, right?
Well, they got angry.
So they did, now they're thinking, well, criticism's not going to work, we're going to have to go to physical means to try to put it off.
Yep. What steps did Nehemiah take to prepare the Jews to face the threats of the enemies? Yep. Addressing the Jewish people, encouraging them not to be afraid, to defend their brethren, sons, daughters, wives, houses. The trumpet as an alarm. Rally to that, and then making making smart decisions for protection. Half the men held spears. Everybody carried a weapon while they worked. That kind of thing. All right. Discussion questions. How should Christians respond to criticism? And I think we've talked about that a little bit already today. But what must we do to overcome discouragement? Yeah, go ahead.
No, but,
Correct.
Well, I've got more, I'm stuck here, whatever. But to lean on God, and another one is don't overcommit. So, we can get overwhelmed, overcommitted to something, and even though you have some successes, you might say, you're not satisfied. I guess I've experienced that myself. And seen it in a lot of other people. And don't try to be I say a one man or one person band. A lot of people don't want to bring other people into what they're doing because we want the credit ourselves, we don't share it around. But, that's the old saying about it's amazing what you do if you don't care who gets the credit. You get other people involved. And to praise God for every success and lean on God.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you for today, and we will see you in a few minutes. Absolutely. My pleasure.